Welcome, everyone. My name's Sean Purdy, and I'm going to be hopefully your coordinator for the subject to any technical issues, which I'm sure we won't have for the rest of this webinar, which is going to focus on offshore wind, technical and environmental and social issues associated with developing offshore wind farms. It's the first of 4 webinars we're putting together. The next ones you've all been invited to are Japan, China, and Taiwan. Next slide, please. So the introduction, that's going to be me. Then Elaine Gregg from RCG will be talking about considerations for developers, regulators, and anyone associated with developing offshore wind from a technical risk perspective, followed by Joseph Park from ERM, and he will be talking about environmental and social risks. We'll have some polling questions at the start of this webinar and at the end, which will hopefully kick off some Q&A. And then there'll be some a summary wrap up and some takeaways, and that will be based on the questions that we've been asked and the answers that we've come up with, and even some opinions on where things are going in the future in Korea. So kamsahamnida, and on to the next slide. So some rules. We encourage people to participate in this webinar. You can post questions. If you've been on Zoom before, you know that the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen, and you can put a question there that we will answer at the appropriate time as we go through the webinar. Webinar is being recorded. And presentation material will be available after the completion of this webinar. We've enabled the English transcript feature, so just click the live transcript at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitle if you need it. And if you have any extra questions or additional requests, you can reach out to us at apacmarketing@erm.com. Next slide. So why are we having these webinars? Well, part of it is obviously because we want to get the ERM name known amongst as many people as possible. I can't deny that, of course. But it's just that the scale of opportunity is increasing exponentially, particularly in North Asia, which is the subject of this series of webinars. I've been working in the power sector in Asia for 25 years, and just some of the changes, the rate of change, the rate of integration of different types of renewable technology is just simply amazing at the moment. It's facilitated by legal and regulatory roadmaps, which are increasingly becoming clearer and transparent. And probably, in my experience in the power sector, which includes from an investment perspective as well, is that is probably the statement made by developers in particular. Clarity of the regulations, consistency of those regulations across the life cycle of your project. And we're starting to see much more of that. Not everything is clear, not every jurisdiction is clear, but certainly it's becoming clearer overall. Also, this is the first offshore, or in fact, the first series of webinars in the power sector that we are hosting with our new sister company, a recent acquisition, RCG, Renewables Consulting Group. Renewables Consulting Group is a purely technical advisor that we cooperated with historically on a number of developments, feasibility studies, due diligences, site screening, etc. And that we got on so well that ERM decided to purchase them. So now we're able to offer a suite of technical and environmental support services for your project development. Next slide, please. Just a few comments from me, just general comments regarding what's going on in the bigger picture. COVID-19, don't need to talk too much more about that, but certainly it's not halting renewable energy growth. And a lot of investment led by sovereign investment countries looking to kickstart their economies. That investment is going into alternative energy, renewable energy, carbon reduction, etc. So the expectation globally, a record expansion of nearly 10% in 2021, we're expecting to see. And I think Korea and other North Asian countries are seeing a greater increase than 10% overall. Next slide, please. Just a comment about the projected scale and complexity of projects as turbine sizes increase. The good news, obviously, is the capital cost per megawatt reduces, but the issues associated with flight path, impingement, bird strike issues, safety, both during operation, shipping, what ships can carry the components, construction safety, etc. They're going to increasingly become part of the risk mitigation analysis that's needed for development of offshore wind. Next slide, please. And it's not just about offshore wind. It's offshore wind as part of a whole change, the whole change of decarbonization. Where are the changes going to happen? And we're starting to see many, and it's extremely popular in media, about green hydrogen, different types of hydrogen, but particularly green hydrogen. And offshore wind is one of the options for green hydrogen, particularly if we look at Australia, which has, for example, a lot of sunlight and a lot of cheap land. There's probably going to be more onshore renewables, but other countries that have good offshore wind capabilities and resources, green hydrogen produced via electricity generation from offshore wind will increasingly be considered, particularly as liquefaction and transportation and other methodologies and technical risks are overcome. My last slide. Just one of the things that's very close to ERM's heart, and obviously everyone, is safety. So as the size, complexity, depth of construction of offshore wind goes up, safety is going to have to be a much higher consideration, or an increasing requirement, to understand what all this new technology means to operation and construction of offshore wind. Okay, that's the last from me, except for I'm now going to introduce my colleague from RCG, and that is Elaine Gregg. Elaine is a director of RCG, an ERM company, and chief technology officer, professional engineer and project director. It's been advising clients on offshore wind farm development in global new markets. She has experience with DNV, experience in the UK, experience in Europe, experience in project management, construction of onshore wind farms, and grid connection and electrical safety and installation work. Elaine, over to you now. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Sean, and hi, everyone. Can we move on to my first slide, then? So first, we're going to just run through some of the market, what it looks like in Korea, fairly sort of high level overview. But I just think it's useful at the start of this just to make sure we all understand where we're at, where we're going. And then the second part is going to be some technical considerations specific to the Southern Korea Peninsula. And then, as Sean said, Joseph's going to go on and talk about the process and the environmental and the considerations for development side. So looking at the South Korea ambitions, it's a significant ambition with a 12 gigawatt target by 2030. A very, very large pipeline in the process at the moment, predominantly floating wind in the southeast and predominantly fixed wind in the west. And when we come on to looking at some maps, we'll see how that lays out. Very, very supportive government. The government actively facilitates cooperation between IPPs, supply chain developers, and government authorities and municipalities as well. With 36 billion support to the large project at Sainan, government's actually getting involved and putting money down as well. The current route to market is a general renewable portfolio standard route for all renewables. It's not specific to offshore wind, but there are movements to start auctioning off areas of the seabed, and then maybe changes to that market as well. In terms of leasing in Korea, it's not typical. Most countries will give you rights based on a technical application, capability, a bid based on price. Whereas in Korea, it's simply if you put your LiDAR out, then you get the right to apply for exclusive business permit. So there's been a little bit of a strange competition for getting LiDARs out, but a lot of LiDARs are out there now, and there's a lot of people developing. There is a government action plan for building of offshore wind, which is recommended preferred locations that the municipalities looking to develop. And Jeolla, North and South, apologies for my pronunciation of Korean place names, obviously very British here, but North and South Gyeongsang provinces are preferred locations for those major projects. As we said, the route to market is a renewables portfolio standard where offshore wind secures the renewable energy credits. We do need a utility partner for PPAs, which is again slightly different to other regions, but it means that the partnerships between IPPs, supply chains, need a utility partner at the moment to be able to secure that route to market and secure the exit. And those targets, it's a very, very significant target. It does look a little odd, perhaps, being that there was a target for 2020, which was missed. 2.5 gigawatt target, 95 megawatt installed, looks like a huge gap. But when we look at the pipelines, we'll see that the pipeline is there. It's not a gap so much as a delay. And those projects are there due to come in. So 12 gigawatts by 2030 is a practical target to aim for. And we see just along the bottom there, the development of the offshore projects actually within Korea. The first demo offshore site, 2012. I do recall I was in Korea at Jeju at a conference about offshore wind, must have been 2014-ish, maybe, plus or minus. So that I recall there was a large conference, lots of people, lots of interest. And then obviously a few years later, 30 megawatt Tamra, and then action plans, and then 60 megawatt projects recently, and huge aspirations for large projects. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So just some facts and figures to sort of put us in an understanding of where we are. As we saw, we said 95 megawatts operational of a 2.5 gigawatt target. But when we look at that left-hand chart, the operational, compare it to the development pipeline, it's kind of swamped. So we can see that there's so many projects in the development pipeline. They're ready to go, and it's just getting them through development, getting them through construction to meet that target of 12 gigawatts. So the targets have initiated a lot of activity. It's not developed into the 2020 target as yet, but what we need to make sure as an industry is that it does achieve the 2030 target. So to date, we've got the 3 megawatt demo, a few 60 megawatt, a couple of 60 megawatt projects. The 100 megawatt Hanlin project is in pre-construction, so that's about to go. And we've got a healthy pipeline. When we look at the owners of these, we've got local and we've got international. So we've got the utilities, Cohen and KEPCO, and then international developers, Macquarie GIG, Ørsted, and Northland. So there's a fairly even split between local and international who are on the lead. The actual operational projects at the moment, they are locally led. So we'll expect to see some more of the international players coming through. And in terms of fixed and floating, more fixed at the moment, which is what you would expect. We start with fixed. Whenever offshore wind goes into any country, you start with fixed because it's the cheaper, easier, closer to shore. But South Korea, the southeastern side, has a huge floating wind resource. Floating wind is not necessarily quite mature enough for the large projects anywhere on the planet at the moment. In Europe, we're still building the sort of smaller scale 100 megawatt projects, but we're on the verge, and it's a technology that's ready to be going for when South Korea actually needs it. So the Ulsan floating wind project, 1.5 gigawatt, we're looking at people developing major scale projects in the floating technology. So whether that feeds into the 2030 target or comes slightly after, there's enough fixed, but maybe some, I think we can see some floating coming through to help meet that target, but still predominantly fixed, we think. Next slide, please. So a very boring slide, it's just a list, but it's just indicating the types of activities and the types of projects that are coming through. All of this information, by the way, is coming from the RCG Global Offshore Wind Annual Market Report, which comes from our GRIT database, which is something that you can access. If anyone wants to access that, we have a free online version, so just let us know. And then there's, obviously, as you expect, there's deeper paid versions if you want more forecasts. But it keeps up with the news, which means that there's a single source there of all the news that's happening. And this is where I've picked all this up from. So we can see, the city of Ulsan is working with a lot of the floating wind development companies on research for localization, for competitiveness, to make sure that that happens in that area. We've got JVs between, so you've got CIP, who's a developer, Stiesdal, who is a technology, and CS Wind, who is a local Korean company. So they've we need these three skill sets to develop projects, so they're working together. Similar arrangement there with Ocean Winds, who is a developer, KHMP is the local utility, and Principal Power is the technology provider. So a lot of those partnerships where you have local and international together. And we've got the Ministry of Trade and Industry signing MOUs with local utilities and companies to develop Southwest Sea. So you've got the government involvement really encouraging and pushing major large projects. Southwest Sea phases 2 and 3 are gigawatt scale projects. In terms of the new project announcements, these obviously, because of the way that the leasing works in South Korea, if someone puts a LiDAR out there, then we can track it, and people have to announce what they're doing, so we track what they're doing. And then people put LiDARs out there, they get the electricity business permits, and those are published. So we've got GIG with 1.5 gig, Equinor 800 meg, Shell and Hexicon 200 meg, CIP 1.2 gig. There's 4 gigawatts of new LiDAR installations just recently gone through, and 12 gig there of new project announcements, people with very high aspirations. And this is just from the market report in June. I'll come on, there's further announcements since then as well. So yeah, a lot of projects at that very early stage, large projects with major players behind them. Next slide, please. So taking that knowledge and looking at the forecast of where we think it's going to go, as Sean mentioned, it's a very, very steep ramp up to that 2030 target. Currently in 2021, about to hit 2022, and we see that there's the timelines people are talking about. The LiDARs have gone out. There's a couple of years of the shipping studies, ground studies. There's a few years of the development type work before these start coming through and into the pipeline. Even so, with our projections, slightly missing that target. So that's the challenge for Korea, is to get that moved forward to meet that target. So it's all there, but with our projections on how long things typically take, and this is with the background framework of being competitive for the renewable energy credits against other technologies and trying to secure that route to market. It needs a bit of a push in our view, but close, getting there. First floating project looking to come through at 2027, so that's that timeline. So if that stays on time, that's 200 megawatts a few years ahead of the 2030 target, and you might see other floating projects coming through. But whether you see any of those gigawatt scale projects coming through by 2030, that's likely to be the fixed wind ones if they're helping meet that target. And then just in the bottom right there, the updates since this market report was published in June. The development pipeline now is in excess of 22 gigawatts overall. RWE has announced it's getting in on the game as well at Ulsan, working with Ulsan Metropolitan City. So huge potential, but it's going from zero to hero very quickly, and that's always a difficult transition to manage and needs everyone very focused. Next slide, please. Just getting into some individual projects, detailed projects, just to understand who's doing what. We can see here that going through pre-construction, consented, and in planning. The rest that we're talking about there are scoping, or they've been published, but they're not actually in the process. These are the projects that are actually in the process coming forwards. And you can see here, in planning, we have some decent sized significant projects, 200 to 400 megawatts. So these are the ones that are most likely to help meet that 12 gig target. I didn't add up that right-hand column, did I? Maybe I should have done that. So I think we do need a few more from the scoping to come through and meet that in planning pipeline, but primarily fixed wind, one floating, a lot there, a lot to work on, a lot for the industry to do in South Korea, a very exciting time. So that's the market, that's the background. I'm going to move on now to a bit more of the technical side and the technical risks of actually doing this in Korea. So let's move on to the next slide and look at some maps. So every country has its own particular set of risks, and commonality obviously between different countries, different risks, but this is particular to South Korea. So if we look at the wind speeds in South Korea, we can see there why all the projects are in the southeast and the southwest. We do have a map with all the projects on. I haven't replicated it here. Like I said, it's on the GRIP database. If you want to see the projects and where they are on the map, let us know and we'll sign you up for a free access to the database, and you can see where all those projects are. But all those fixed projects are in that orange area on the southwest. The floating projects in the orange area are on the southeast. There are a number of projects all down the west coast as well. So that's being developed, probably because it's close to the population centres and it needs the power. There's actually no projects in that northeast green area at present. That's a place that developers haven't gone. But in terms of particular risks within design, construction and operation, it's not the location of the wind farms relative to wind speed we're looking at, it's the environment. And we do have an area here that's typhoon class turbines. So we have to have the wind turbines with a higher class, and we need the insurance to take care of typhoon damage. Not a huge number of typhoons, but and you know, when we see typhoons going through, we see a lot more in onshore in America, because obviously that's where wind farms and typhoons have met up to now. a typhoon, a hurricane, as it is in America, can take out one wind farm or solar plant and leave the one next door. It's very, very narrow tracks. So it is a game of luck. But this is very similar to neighboring Japan and Taiwan. Have to consider in the design and consider the worst case scenario of what if you do get hit by the typhoon. Key technical risk, we can see on the tidal currents there. We're looking at some hotspots down in the southwest and the northwest. Thankfully, though, that's where it's fixed, so it's difficult for construction, but you're not looking at it during operations. But the tidal currents can be higher than we typically see, for example, in the North Sea. We're quite sheltered in the North Sea, but we have some strong tidal currents here. So that is an important consideration when looking at construction and the safety aspects of construction and operations, and when you can get people to and from the site and how vessels can operate in the site. If there are floating wind sites in the tidal areas, the safety of the anchoring and making sure that literally the turbines don't float off. So that's a fairly new consideration that maybe we have to take into account of in Korea, that is only a Korea that we haven't brought in from elsewhere. We can bring knowledge in from the wave and tidal industry, just how do we operate vessels in high tidal flow areas. And the geology, we don't know a huge amount of the geology as a wide-scale industry in the area yet. We have some data. Obviously, there's mapping data here. There's good data at the substrate levels. We obviously look at the coastline and we look at the types of islands that are coming out and interpret from that to the south and underneath. But we don't have a wealth of actual sites with actual site data. And we do believe that the ground conditions are kind of maybe a bit rocky, maybe a bit uneven. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and ground risk is always the biggest uncertainty with wind farms everywhere until you actually get that data and you know what you're looking at. So that is quite a big risk for South Korea until we've got some kind of certainty on the ground conditions that we're looking at. We also have, there's a fault line that runs just to the west of the peninsula. So you've got tectonic plates meeting, a high risk of earthquake compared to other areas. And then again, this is similar to Japan. We have to design the wind farm for earthquake tolerance, but then you also have to bring in the insurance and those extreme scenarios where you do actually get some damage. Because we do have this in California and Japan, there is precedent building already, so there are precedents to take from. It's not starting from a zero, but we do need to bring those in and make sure they're applied in the Korean environment. Next slide, please. So off the actual site, looking at the infrastructure around the sites, offshore wind requires infrastructure. We need grid connections, we need ports, we need vessels, we need to be serviced. It's not something that exists in isolation. So we have always got risks with the infrastructure and the infrastructure availability. Grid connection, we have to keep in mind that we are building power stations here. So the power stations drive where the grid is. We're not looking at the grid and going, where can we connect? It's not a servant to the master-servant relationship where we're the servant. We are the master, we control where that grid goes. So we end up defining that power grid. When you're talking about 1.5 gigawatt projects, we define new upgrades, but that does mean there's going to be upgrades, there's going to be huge amounts of work. At the moment, it's quite small projects, so we can fit in or we can take the place of decommissioning nuclear. And if there's large decommissioning nuclear, there's huge opportunities there for large sites to jump on and make use of the transmission infrastructure. We do have a large countrywide imbalance, so that there's a lot of generation in the centre and southeast, and all the consumption is in the northwest. So that's where those northwest wind farms have an opportunity to bypass the transmission and go straight to consumption areas. But the southern and eastern wind farms are going to be making use of that infrastructure. And when that's full, which it will be, then there's going to be need to have major transmission infrastructure from the generation to the use, and that'll be right across the country. And that will be quite some substantial work for the grid companies. And we've just got to make sure that that's done as an industry ahead of the wind farms needing that infrastructure, because that could become a delay to deployment of offshore wind if it's not there and we're dependent upon it. People have mentioned shipping. Korea does have a substantial shipping industry, and we can see from the tracks there, those red lines are ship tracks, huge amounts of passing shipping. But it doesn't translate directly into the availability of construction and operations vessels for offshore wind, because the shipping that Korea manufactures are very, very large tankers and container ships, and it's not the same kind of ships that we use for offshore wind. We use sort of the oil and gas and dredging, and the smaller scale in that, but much larger than fishing. So we're sort of in the middle in terms of size. So that we have a huge shipping industry, but it needs to adapt to understand the needs of offshore wind and service that. And associated to that shipping industry are the ports. We've got many, many large, well-serviced ports. And I haven't been to any, but I see the pictures online. They're stunningly beautiful, slick ports, but they're also huge for the huge shipping that we're talking about. They may be heavily utilized, so we have competition for access. So we probably still do need some adaptation for offshore wind uses for the vessels that we use. It's great that we've got the ports there. We just need to figure out which ones are the ones that are most appropriate to offshore wind and make sure that those work and are upgraded and made to work for offshore wind. So next slide, please. In terms of project design, construction and operational experience, there's, as always, a lot of pluses and minuses. So in South Korea, there's a strong shipping industry. There's a lot of engineering capability, general engineering capability is strong. There are those first domestic offshore wind projects in place, so there's some experience there already, a great pool of transferable engineering skills. Korean companies have seen that this is coming to Korea, so working next door in Taiwan and getting that experience in Taiwan. They're slightly ahead in Taiwan, so it's bringing that experience and bringing it back to South Korea. So huge opportunity there and a huge capability. But we do have to understand and recognize those risks. There's no significant offshore oil and gas industry, so we haven't got a massive pool of people with that familiar knowledge that we can bring across. We have limited knowledge in Korea of conducting marine operations, designing for marine structures, knowing what all those risks are when designing those structures and designing for construction of an offshore wind farm, and then actual design and management of major offshore infrastructure. That doesn't inherently exist within the Korean engineering. So many companies, they must rely on overseas engineering firms, and that's what we're seeing. We have the large engineering firms in Korea, and they're bringing in European design experts to advise on what do we need to understand, what other things that we need to learn. So we'll see those partnerships building as we get more and more projects, and as we get more and more European American owners, they'll bring in their knowledge as well. So it's very much a case of everyone brings in more knowledge, everyone's learning together, and fairly soon we'll have the competence for design and construction within Korea. All that comes with some language and cultural differences. We have to recognize there's always going to be those. I think everyone I've seen is very open to trying to understand everyone's cultural perception. But sometimes someone makes an assumption for a cultural reason that you don't realize, because the person making the assumption doesn't know it's assumption. The person on the other side doesn't realize that assumption's been made, and sometimes there's confusion. So we just have to make sure we all understand where we're coming from, our assumptions, and bring in every expert that we can to make sure that we've got everything covered. And then next slide, please. In order to service this, we've got the design and construction, but then it's the local supply chain. So for any wind farm in any new area, we might be using local supply chain, we might be using international supply chain. And that's a key consideration of where that balance is. The equator project in Japan largely used external supply chain. So turbines were from outside Japan. The vessel for installation was outside Japan. And clearly that's not an aspiration for Japan. It wants its own supply chain. But doing the first one with, actually it's easier if we have significantly more familiarity, and then we start building in the Japan's supply chain for the later ones. In South Korea, we have a slightly different position, where we have the local wind turbines supply is emerging. The suppliers have built onshore sites, they've supplied components to international suppliers, and they've got designs there ready for offshore wind. So there's a reasonable expectation that domestic wind turbine supply will grow and indeed could dominate the market. But there is also obviously the international suppliers available to supply to the market. And there's very, very few large HV cable suppliers globally, and South Korea has one. So for international cable supply, power and telecommunications, that's available locally, as well as other supply regionally in China, Japan, and the Asian network. What the supply chain doesn't have at present, it's that set of EPC companies, the kind of companies that get built up with an oil and gas industry, with a dredging industry that we have from the North Sea and from Holland. So that's where the experience from Taiwan, from elsewhere, needs to come in. And we do see the EPC type companies from Korea trying to work in Europe and trying to bring that back. But that needs to be built. And similarly, the same vessels, the operations companies, we started in Europe with literal fishing vessels that we converted. Now the turbines are so much bigger, it needs to start with decent vessels for operations from the outset. So that's something that doesn't exist. Why would it? And that's something that needs to be built within the current country. So we need new fleets, we need new marine operations, we need new construction vessels and new operations vessels. And they can be built in country or they can be imported, but they need to be available, obviously, for a very, very large portfolio. And all those developers are going to be looking at, where am I getting mine? And there might be a mix of decisions of what people move forward with. There are Korean national conglomerates that may dominate the contracting landscape. We have to be sure, we want local content, every country wants local content, but we have to be sure that that doesn't end up an accidental constraint on the market, because the ramping up required is huge. So I think a mix of bringing local conglomerates, but also bringing in that international supply chain is required to meet those large targets and get up that ramp. The international players and financiers do need support to access the market, understanding the risks of the market, and understanding how the supply chain works and how to get into that market. And yeah, it needs to ramp very quickly with that balance of local content and international supply. So that's it. Final slide. I'm finished. I hope that was interesting for you. And I think I'll pass back to Sean now.
Thanks a lot, Elaine. And I'm hoping that we're going to get a few more questions come up, which we'll be very pleased to answer. But what we're going to do now is to bring up a couple of poll questions, just some simple questions, to have a break between all the words that are going on to you at the moment, before Joseph from ERM talks about the environmental social side. So just some fairly general polls. We're having, please answer as soon as you read it. We're just waiting to see where you think the most activity for your company in the 4 countries, in the 4 jurisdictions that are covered by our webinars are coming. So if you'd like to tap on one of them. Interesting. I thought Japan would be a little bit quieter, but I guess what a lot of people are saying is that it's going to be slower than anticipated in Japan. I'm not allowed to vote, but I think what I can say is for us at ERM, the rate of inquiries regarding Korean projects is at its fastest rate. The growth of inquiries is the fastest in Korea. But also, I think it's reasonable to suspect with round 3 coming up that Taiwan is going to be very busy as well. So that was useful. The second polling question is, where's it going to happen next? So we should get those questions up now. Obviously, this is across Asia Pacific. Do you want me to make a prediction? Let's see. Oh, neck and neck, Vietnam and Australia. I think Australia's come up because of the seabed legislation that's just been passed. Vietnam, I don't think anyone, even 2 years ago, would have said that there would be this much interest in offshore wind in Vietnam. India, 1 vote. Other, I'd be interested in others, maybe Indonesia or somewhere else. Maybe somebody who put a different country could, in the question box, put which countries they think might be of interest. Excuse me. Okay, thank you for filling in those polls. We'll now go to our second speaker, who is Joseph Park from ERM. He's going to talk about environmental and social risks associated with the development of offshore wind projects. He's currently leading multiple offshore wind farm environmental social impact assessments in South Korea. He's led up more than 20 ENS screenings for offshore wind developments in South Korea. Lots of work for lenders for project financing across the renewable and power sector in South Korea. And another very interesting comment, which is referenced there, is the number of Korean banks that are now signing up to equator principles, which means acceptance of IFC guidelines and other guidelines are mandated by signatories to equator principles. So Korea in the planning, impact assessment, and project management side of things. So Joseph, please go ahead.
Right, hello everybody. Great to meet you all. Very nice to see you. My name is Joseph Park. I'm Principal Consultant of ERM Korea. I am leading the impact assessment and planning team of Seoul office. Yeah, so cautious of time, I'll try to be brief. Today I'm going to talk about the environmental and social risk of the offshore wind development within Korea. Please, can we move on, please? Next slide. Yep, so on the left-hand side, it's showing the rather simplified version of complex steps involving an offshore development. So we'll start off with the site screening, and once the developer has a candidate site, then they will commence the 1-year wind measurement. The 1-year wind measurement is prerequisite of a key license called Electrical Business License, EBL, which a offshore developer needs to become a power generator. So 1 full year of wind measurement with EBL, then the developer moves into phase of considering a range of permits and grid connection. Once those are sorted, and move on to construction phase. Right-hand side showing is the key permits that drives the offshore wind, which is called public water occupancy permit, driven by the law stipulated under and run by the Ministry of Fishery. To acquire this occupancy permit, there are a series of studies that needs to be submitted as an annex of the application, which involves one of the main document, the regulatory EIA, and then public water utilization consultation reports, maritime traffic safety assessment reports, cultural heritage assessment reports, and military operation and impact assessment and radio impact assessment reports, disaster impact assessment, and some degree of element of fishery damage impact assessment that has to go in. So as you can see, it's quite complex and series of a study that needs to be fed in and is run by different ministry. And depending on where you are, the emphasis of each of these studies might vary. So and they all need to be taken care of as part of applying for the occupancy permit. I want to focus a bit more on the regulatory EIA side. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is based upon the main driver law. So in Korea, regulatory EIA is driven by act called Environmental Impact Assessment Act. According to the act, these are the predefined procedure under the act. If you ask one of the consultant asking how long would the typical regulatory EIA would take for an offshore development, the answer would typically be 18 months. And the rationale for 18 months is shown in the left-hand side of this diagram. So the procedure will start off with something called preliminary statement of assessment and report development, the PSA. So this is a scoping report which the regulatory EIA will be performed of. The developer kickstart the procedure by submitting PSA to the approving entity, which case for us will be the Ministry of Trade and Infrastructure and Energy, MOTI. Upon the receiving of PSA, MOTI will ask Ministry of the Environment to form a council called EIA Review Council. The council will be composed of 11 people that's predefined under the Act, and the council will take 30 days to review the PSA, and they will return the developer with the terms of reference. The TOR becomes the basis for the regulatory EIA, and the process kicks off. And about the halfway into the 1-year-long baseline survey activity, the developer has to submit something called a draft EIA. And this is one of the key steps for the regulatory EIA steps. So with the submission of draft EIA, it will be disclosed in the manner that's predefined under the Act. And then at this parallelly, the developer will be asked to present to the community of the project, where the community is mainly focusing on the community within the area of influence defined within the regulatory the EIA itself. And depending on the size and footprint of the project, the developer will decide at which level they will present the case. It could be city level, district level, or even at the township level. And upon the disclosure and upon the presentation, the comment will be collected and returned to the developer. And then reflecting the comments, the developer would update the rest of half of the baseline program, and for the 6 months, and then will submit the final EIA. And then with that EIA, the Ministry of Environment, with the support from entity like KIE, they will spend 2 to 3 months reviewing it, and that will probably pretty much take you the regulatory EIA process, given that all things go right. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this next slide is showing the where the international ESIA is coming slot in based upon the regulatory EIA schedule. The upper portion, the yellow part, is the what we just discussed, the regulatory EIA. So starting from PSA submission in about in 8 months' time, 18 months' time, then if things go smoothly, then we expect to get an approval. And basically the international ESIA will run in parallel. The international ESIA will start off with something called scoping report, where it will try to identify key gaps from the regulatory EIA's PSA, so their scope of EIA study. Then the scoping report will ensure that all the gaps are filled compared with the applicable international standard that will the lenders might ask, or the internal corporation requirement will ask. So once the scoping report is done, and then the scoping report will wait until the terms of reference will come from the authority. Then they will kickstart of 1 year of baseline. Then towards the end of baseline program, we'll submit the international ESIA. ESIA report will wait for the comments coming from the authority on the regulatory EIA to ensure that all the commitment and approval conditions and commitments are captured in the ESIA as well. So the emphasis that we are making here is that if you run the program parallelly, the program can be run, the assessment process for both the regulatory side as well as the international ESIA becomes effective in terms of cost and in terms of time as well. So that's our always recommendation to when you start considering the regulatory EIA step as one of the permits, then please do consider the international side of the assessment. Can we move on to next slide, please? So very quickly, then why would one has to spend extra money doing the international ESIA where the law is not required? It is mainly because of the financial sector and the ever so fast changing environment. This slide shows you the recent trend of ESG and then equator principle on commercial banks. On the left-hand side is showing this increasing trend. So equator principle is environmental and social risk management framework adopted by global banks on a voluntary basis. So the intention is to identify a risk upon the early stage and come up with a mitigation control measure that they can feel comfortable of to ensure that their project finance and their loan is safe, and then the project maintains its cash flow. So the equator principle started off back in 23 with 10 banks. Over the 20 years, the number of banks have been increased an annual average of 12.5%, which makes now we have 126 members as of 2021. And that is roughly, and then if you could make the focus on the gray portion, which represents the commercial banks in APAC, that number is what drives the rapid increase number of the equator principle of finance institutes. And it is now comprised of 25%. If you include the Middle East banks or Australian banks, that number now increased to 30%. In case of Korea, it's shown in right bottom side. There are all 5 major commercial banks have joined the equator principle as of now, and IBK is expected to join the equator principle first quarter of next year. So you can pretty much assume that any major bank that you bump into, even within Korea, they are now committed for equator principle. So what is the main driver? The first driver will be the peer pressure. If you just go through the adoption date of these commercial banks of Korea, it sort of tells you the story. So Shinhan Bank being the most adventurous, the most advanced bank, they adopted equator principle last September, very quickly followed by KB, who joined in February. And when it comes to August, the rest 3 banks have joined. So that makes Uri Bank, Hana Bank, and Nongyeon Bank. So there's a peer pressure working on them, and the source of peer pressure is the social expectation on the commercial sector on their need to improve the ESG performance. Additional mark on the sustainability index is another driver for them. So if you adopt the equator principle, you get extra mark for indexes such as DJSI and so on. But last, most importantly, simply the banks wants to manage their risk, and in terms of framework wise and capability and resource wise, they want to have this ability to see the risk upfront and being able to manage it, and that's the driver. Yeah, so can we move on to next slide? So I won't dwell too much. So this is the equator principle. Here is composed of 10 principles, which ask the technical reference to IFC performance standards, and these are what we typically call when it comes to international ESIA. These are so-called internationally recognized environmental and social standards. So again, we are making an emphasis that when you start the regulatory EIA side, please ensure that you consider these international standards as well, because it becomes more and more difficult for anybody to project finance any development, even with the local financing, now that all the banks have committed for equator principle. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yep, so we now set a basis why we need to do ESIA. Then what are the next question would be, what are the key gaps between the regulatory EIA and international ESIA? And then there are quite some considerable gap based upon our experience. To begin with, biodiversity, the methodology and the survey frequency, etc., of the migratory bird or marine mammal species, that there are some gaps. And then when it comes to the recognition of species, the regulatory EIA will dwell and focus on the species stipulated under the local law only, whereas the international ESIA will consider the database of internationally recognized species. And the critical habitat assessment element is rarely been touched in the regulatory side, as well as the commitment and management plan that's spinning out from those impact assessment, including biodiversity action plans and so. So biodiversity, when it comes to marine mammal and the marine bird, we have seen some considerable gaps so far. Next slide, please. Social as well, there are big gaps in the social. It's mainly because in Korea, the EIA, the regulatory EIA, is covered by Ministry of Environment, and the fishery compensation side is run by separate law under the Ministry of Fishery. There's big this gap in the social side of the assessment as well. Regulatory EIA social chapter will mainly focus on mainly based on the literature review of the demographic of the nearby community, whereas in the international ESIA social chapter will be a lot more depth, and the scope will be a lot more bigger. And when it comes to defining stakeholder, Korea, due to the this small boundary of fishery impact damage assessment, they will largely focus on the fishery, where the international studies will have a bigger definition of stakeholder. And the absence of stakeholder engagement plan in their documents is often found, and consideration of livelihood impact is often missing. The fishery impact damage impact assessment in Korea will mainly focus on physical compensation of fisheries, whereas the livelihood element will be lightly touched, and then the other stakeholder as well. For example, the tourism industry is often not been considered in depth. So, and next one, please. And when it comes to international ESIA, the lenders will ask you to consider the climate change aspect of it. So they will ask, considering the drastic and extreme event, weather event, they will ask questions of whether the project will be still operatable with this series of changing in the climate, and then and they will ask the project to consider the impact according to the predefined methodology under TCFD, and human rights impact assessment as well. Human rights impact assessment is often a area that we normally experience a huge pushback from the local guys in a sense that they think human rights issue is only applicable to the developing country. But if you think about it, for example, in fishery industry, the illegal or foreign worker working for a Korean person-owned vessel, when they get physical compensation, only the vessel owner will be subject to the compensation, and because of their legal status, they might not be subject to legal compensation, which in the international eye will open up a human rights issue. So even in Korea, the lenders will ask you to consider the human rights impact. Moving on, please, next slide. And cumulative impact assessment in Korea, regulatory EIA is quite lightly touched. An alternative assessment as well, the lenders will ask the developer to consider a technically and financially feasible and cost-effective option to reduce and minimize the project-related ENS impact. So the alternative consideration of alternative options needs to be shown in the impact assessment report, which often is missed in the regulatory EIA. Next slide, please. We talked about the study itself, but then when it comes to field management, we also see some gaps as well. In Korea, there wasn't really no need for anybody to go out in the offshore and take the extensive field activity that we are talking about now, as Korea doesn't have any offshore resources. But and therefore, in our experience, when it comes to field management, we have seen quite a huge gap, especially in the safety side as well. They don't have the management system or framework to identify those risks, and also when it comes to documentation as well. For example, the risk assessment and all the other standard documents that's normally would have been made for any other places in the world is often being missing, and consideration of project-specific safety risk when it comes to field work is not being there. And the anti-bribery and corruption as well, we see some gaps. What the local EIA consultant often take that as a market standard practice is in international eye can be quite challenging in terms of ABC, might not be acceptable. And the level of the quality of the progress or field reporting, we've seen quite a gap as well. So in the to wrap things up, so there are quite considerable gap between the local EIA, regulatory EIA, and international ESIA, and your local partner or local developer might push back on the consideration of international ESIA, but it's very important that we communicate with them that the financial sector environment has drastically changed for last even few months. So because of this huge ESG pressure, and then it will be virtually quite impossible to project finance, even with the local commercial banks moving forward. So our recommendation is consider the international side as early as you could, and when you start considering the regulatory EIA side, that will make the project more effective in terms of cost and time. And if you leave it to last minute, then the ESIA might become the critical pathway, potentially causing the project delay. So yeah, so that's our key message here. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sean.
Yep, thanks a lot, Joseph. I learned quite a bit from that presentation. and mainly because of the rate of what is changing, how fast some of the requirements and some of the opportunities are changing. So thank you very much for that. We've now got a couple of audience polls again before we go to Q&A and summary. So one is more technical, and then the second one will be more environmental. So it's just asking, what do you think the biggest challenge to delivery of offshore wind in Korea at the moment? This is more fundamentally from the technical risk side. While we're doing that, waiting for that, I will ask if anyone does have questions, could you please put them in the Q&A chat? The button is at the bottom of your screen. We've got one question so far, which was asked in private mode, but we're sort of going to answer it, I believe, in a general way, anyway, which would be more of a comment on projections for the capacity of opportunities in offshore wind. Okay, so possibly site conditions and supply chain may have been before seeing this, the results of this poll may have been what we would have thought of, but I think supply chain is a very valid one, and obviously site conditions. Stating the obvious, every country has different site conditions. Okay, can we go to the second question? Thank you. I know we've got choose any one, and then we've asked to select three, but I think the correct answer is you can select up to three of your top environmental and social concerns here. I think the top option might come out top. I'm prepared to stick my neck out here. Fishery community opposition. We'll wait and see. I think we're having a technical issue possibly with this poll. We haven't got any answers yet. So what I think has happened is there's been some glitch, because I'm sure most people on the call, or some people would have liked to answer this question. Just check to see if anything's come through. Wait another 15 or 30 seconds, and then I'll make some comments and we can go on to a bit more Q&A. We're still very keen to hear some questions from you. Okay, well, maybe I'll just ask Joseph, you, just based on the questions there, if you could just comment on what do you think, you yourself personally think are the three top environmental and social concerns that you've come across in the work that you've done?
the fishery is certainly top one that our clients has been asking, as well as the marine mammal and birds issues as well. And then depending on where you are, the military becomes quite a big of issue. You know, places like Incheon, which is near the border, there are movements of submarine wood, which is not publicly made available. So so I shall say fishery, biodiversity, and military, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Right, now we'll move on to Q&A now. I'll just make some comments. We have got another question. What did I take out of this webinar was, you know, some comments about the load, the demand for electricity is not always in the same area as where the wind farms are. As Elaine said, the wind farms are built where the wind is, and then there has to be a transmission interconnection system to bring the electricity to the required areas. Quite a big one, as Joseph referred to, was the instigation of EP4 signatories, the local domestic banks now becoming EP4 signatories. So there's two ways of looking at it, I think, is that it does put some more focus on environmental and social issues, but also all the companies represented on this call, you know, a senior level, a corporate, responsible, socially and environmentally responsible company. So the opposition that you'll be working against other offshore wind developers will be working to the very similar standards, access to finance, etc. So maybe it levels the playing field a little bit out, a bit more. The other thing I'd say is there were some material and construction supply gaps. Cable suppliers, there's plenty of them in Korea, but you know, turbine suppliers not so much. But what I do think is that a number of the Korean, as we know, the Korean companies are extremely good at construction and participate globally. So those gaps and those shortages will close quite quickly, but potentially the capacity of the domestic market to fill the total requirement, you know, the second off the rack, the third off the rank series of offshore wind farms will be compromised. So that the supply chain risk comes into things as well. Okay, we'll just open up the questions now. Our question is, what are the anti-typhoon measures for the floating type wind turbine in South Korea? I think that's one for you, Elaine, if you're able to mention anti-typhoon measures for floating offshore wind farms.
I think at the moment, that's, to be honest, in the currently being studies and figured out category, there isn't actual measures for the floating wind farms. The turbines themselves need to be designed for a typhoon, which is the higher class that we're getting in Taiwan. But when it comes to floating wind, we're looking at the anchors and we're looking at whether the cables are buried or whether they're floating. And do you actually want, in the case of a typhoon, those anchors to hold, which creates pressure on the mooring lines, or do you actually want them to give way and then you've got something floating around? It's one of those where, is it better to have a sacrificial weak point? Presumably we do want to keep them in place so they're not floating about, but don't know, it may not be the best thing. One of the biggest things in a typhoon situation is the debris after the effect, and this is something that the Japanese regulations are very on top of, is making sure that debris doesn't limit reconstruction efforts. So some of the anti-typhoon measures are going to be about, if something does get hit with a typhoon, trying to contain the damage, because you've got to accept that it's going to be damaged. So it's containing that damage and then recovering elements. But we'd have to look to Taiwan to see the level of extreme weather that those turbines can actually withstand before that damage occurs, because that design is the same one taken forward.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. I'm going to ask you another question now. I hope you'll forgive me for asking you a question, but is there, we mentioned floating wind turbine design in the question just answered. Is there any emerging technology in floating offshore wind that you think will be most suited to Korea, or is it too early to say at this stage? There's competing technologies and there's no clear winner or clear winners yet.
Yeah, at the moment, when we're looking at floating wind, and a number of our clients are doing this, they're doing the kind of the sweep of the market. There is no dominant design, but there's probably a handful of 5 designs that are coming out as becoming dominant. So there's 20, 40, 60 designs you can look at, but there's a handful. But those handful are very different from each other. So we don't know what's going to come out top. And what actually comes out top is going to depend substantially on the local site conditions, because it's about the depth of the water column, but also the local supply chain and the ports. So some designs, they may be equivalent when you're actually looking at the site offshore, but you have a local supply chain that can make that one and deliver it to site, and actually it works better in that region. So I think that local supply chain is going to be key in determining which of the floating options actually comes out better.
Okay, thank you. And we just the previous question that I referred to was asking about numbers and data. And I think maybe if Joseph or somebody or Elaine could make some comments about the data in terms of the number of opportunities and number of gigawatts, and a lot of it's changing very quickly. So is there something could somebody mention or comment on the projections for the capacity of offshore wind opportunities in Korea?
Yeah, I think if I start, I think Joseph can pick up. The important thing to understand on the data is, especially with anything future, is it's all very uncertain and everything's going to change. The one thing you can absolutely guarantee about that data is it will have changed by the time it's actually happened. And we've got so many projects here in scoping stage. Someone might have announced 1.5 gig. By the time it's built, it might be 1 gig, it might be 2 gig. It can be very, very different. So our data guys, they trawl, they look at all the data, they sweep it up, and then they will filter, because you might get conflicting sources, or you might have conflicting, you might be able to choose, we'll use that number or that number, and they have filters that they use to be able to use those. And then new projects come up, you don't always pick them up immediately. So yeah, the data is useful as a projection, it's useful to see the overview, but I wouldn't home in on any individual particular number and say that's wrong, because it probably is. We don't know until it's actually been built. Even when it's been built, we don't know if it's right, because we've got records online of European wind farms at the capacity, and we know that 3 of the turbines aren't working because there was a failure, but we don't record all that. It's noise. So the data's there to look at trends. But Joseph, you know particular differences that might appear in Korea.
Right. So we do a couple of ESIAs, and we've done a large number of screening, and it is maybe because there's a range of factors that's playing in. So when the developer is dealing with the authority, they can't really submit their permit based upon the coming future technology. I mean, they could, but then it's just, then you go down to this local authority trying to explain that the market trend, how big the turbine is going to come. And because also the Korean governments are pushing the local contents as well, in terms of, and the local turbine developer has certain limitations. So they don't want to sort of present the actual turbine size of consideration. That could be one reason. And other reason might be there's a limited access to which the KEPCO allows in terms of grid connections. So where they actually plan is a lot bigger, the developer tends to sort of tone down their size of projects. So there's this and you're bound to those confidential information. So my experience is the size and actual size and their plan is a lot bigger. It's just that then publicly they for many reasons they sort of tone it down. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. Can we just go to the next slide, which shows the survey, so people still on the call can, yeah, scan the code and make some comments about how they feel this webinar went today. I think we've answered the questions that we've raised, so we are coming towards the end, but we'll leave that survey code there for a little bit longer. And last call for questions. Okay, so I'll just make some final comments. Really appreciate everybody who joined today. The presentations will be available. I understand that they will, if my memory is correct, automatically be sent to people. But please, within those presentations, there's contacts all the people on this call, various people from ERM and RCG. So please reach out to us. Very exciting times in South Korea for offshore wind. And we hope to potentially see some of you at the next offshore wind webinar, which is going to be on Japan this Thursday. So thank you everyone for joining, and hope to hear from you at some stage in the near future. Thank you particularly to Joseph and Elaine for your presentations.